These mechanics cause the biggest headaches for players during the combat phase: Deathtouch, Trample, and Double Strike, especially when there's Indestructible and Protection involved. And now with the new Foundation's rules for blocking, players have even more questions. So let's break down all these mechanics and some examples you need to know so you'll never have any questions about these mechanics again.
Oh my god. I get it.
Let's start with the mechanic I've had the most questions about since the Foundation's rules change: Trample. Turning to the comprehensive rules for Trample, there are currently 7 rules for this mechanic, and I think it will be easiest to cover those as I go through an example. Trample is a static ability that modifies the rules for assigning and attacking creatures combat damage. This ability has no effect when the creature with Trample is blocking or dealing non-combat damage. We'll start with the basic example and work our way up. I control a Duskdale Worm, a 7/7 with Trample. I attack my opponent with it. My opponent blocks the worm with a 2/2 Grizzly Bear. Now, before you decide to click ahead, I implore you to bear with me here, as it's really important we understand the basics and foundations of Trample before we move on to some more advanced examples. So our opponent blocks with the 2/2, and assuming nothing else happens, we move to the combat damage step, and we look to assign our damage. Assuming we would like to trample some damage over to our opponent, we must first assign lethal damage to the bear. Lethal damage in this case is an amount of damage greater than or equal to a creature's toughness. So we simply need to assign 2 points of damage to the bear. Important rules note: when checking for lethal damage, you take into account any damage that is already marked on the creature, but you ignore any effects or abilities that would change the amount of damage that's actually dealt. For example, if you had a gratuitous violence in play, which doubles the damage your creatures would deal, lethal damage to the bear is still considered to be 2 points of unmodified damage, even though the bear would end up taking 4 damage once it has been dealt. Once we've assigned our lethal damage, we can then assign the remaining excess damage to the player. Or if we're attacking a battle or a planeswalker, we could assign it to those permanents. Now, if your creature had Trample over Planeswalker, which as of the recording of this video, only Thraster Tempest Roar has it. After you assign lethal damage to any creatures defending the Planeswalker, you can then assign damage equal to at least the amount of loyalty of the Planeswalker, and then any remaining damage can be assigned to the player. Okay, let's cover some common variants to this situation that you need to know about. We're attacking with the Duskdale Worm, and our opponent blocks with the Grizzly Bear. At the end of the Declare Blockers step, we Fatal Push the bear. Now usually, if the worm didn't have Trample, the worm would still be considered blocked, and would not deal any damage to the defending player, battle, or planeswalker. However, thanks to Trample, and Rule 702.19d, if an attacking creature with Trample or Trample over Planeswalker is blocked, but there are no creatures blocking it when damage is assigned, its damage is assigned to the defending player and or planeswalker as though all blocking creatures have been assigned lethal damage. The same is true for Trample over Planeswalkers. If the planeswalker is removed from combat, once lethal damage is assigned to any creatures blocking the attack, any remaining damage is dealt straight to the player. Now this is only true for creatures with Trample over Planeswalkers. Any other creatures, including those with normal Trample, will not be able to reassign their damage to the defending player. This brings us to our last Trample rule, 702.19g. Multiple instances of Trample and Trample over Planeswalkers on the same creature are redundant. Sorry team, there's no such thing as double Trample. One more interesting example to consider with Trample. If we attack our opponent with a vanilla 4/2 and a 4/5 with Trample, and our opponent blocks both of our attackers with a 1/4 Palace Guard that can block any number of creatures, when we get to the combat damage step, we can assign 4 damage to the Palace Guard from our vanilla 4/2, And because lethal damage has now been assigned to the blocker, we can now simply assign all 4 damage from our Trampler straight to the player. So that's everything you need to know about the basics of Trample. Let's continue to build upon these examples as we take a look at our next mechanic, Deathtouch. Deathtouch is a static ability with a simple property. Any non-zero amount of damage assigned to a creature by a source with Deathtouch is considered to be lethal damage. For example, here's a classic commander synergy. If you combine Goblin Sharpshooter and Basilisk Collar, when you activate Goblin Sharpshooter and target Golter Primal Hunger, that single point of Deathtouch damage is enough to destroy the Golter. Now let's look at an example in action. Let's give our trampling creature Deathtouch and see how that changes things. We attack our opponent with a 7/7 worm with Trample and Deathtouch. Our opponent now decides to block with a World Spine Worm, a 15/15. We move to the combat damage step. Now remember, to be able to trample damage over to our opponent, we must assign lethal damage to any creature blocking our Trampler. But as we've just discussed, thanks to Deathtouch, any non-zero amount of damage is considered to be lethal damage. So here we can simply assign 1 point of damage to the World Spine Worm and then assign the remaining 6 damage to our opponent. Easy. Now, if our opponent decided to block with multiple creatures, we repeat the exact same steps we've been doing. We assign lethal damage to all the creatures blocking, and any remaining damage will trample over to our opponent. But what happens in this case when the defending creature has something like Protection or Indestructible? Will that change any outcomes here? Let's first quickly break down these abilities. Anything with Indestructible means a permanent with Indestructible can't be destroyed. Such permanents aren't destroyed by lethal damage, and they ignore the state-based action that checks for lethal damage. Effectively, regular damage and effects that say destroy won't affect an indestructible permanent. Of course, they can still be exiled, and indestructible creatures can still go to the graveyard if they have 0 or less toughness. Protection, on the other hand, gives the player or permanent protection from certain things. Protection is usually written in this layout: Protection X. What that means is the permanent or player with that ability can't be damaged, enchanted, equipped, fortified, targeted, or blocked by permanent spells and abilities with characteristic X. Let's go back to our Deathtouch example. We attack with our 7/7 Trampling Deathtouch Worm, and our opponent blocks with a Progenitus, a 10/10 with protection from everything. Once again, we need to assign lethal damage here, but as we discussed earlier, when checking for lethal damage, you ignore any effects or abilities that would change the amount of damage that's actually dealt. So even though Progenitus has protection from our worm and won't take any damage from it, we can still assign it 1 lethal on paper point of Deathtouch damage, and trample the remaining 6 damage to our opponent. The exact same outcome is true if our opponent blocks with an indestructible creature, for example, Impervious Great Worm. We assign 1 point of lethal Deathtouch damage, even though the Great Worm would end up surviving, and the rest to our opponent. Okay, final ability we need to talk about here, Double Strike. A quick refresher, a creature with Double Strike gets to deal combat damage in both the first strike damage step and in the normal combat damage step. Now if you've been keeping up so far, you should be able to comment down below how much damage will our opponent take if we attack with a 7/7 Deathtouch Trample Double Strike Worm, and our opponent blocks with a 9/9 Ancient Brontodon. Pause the video if you need a second. Okay, so let's go through it. As mentioned, because our worm has Double Strike, we'll get to deal damage first during the first combat damage step, so we'll deal 1 point of lethal damage to the dinosaur and trample over 6 to our opponent, and before we get to the next combat damage step, there's a round of priority, and it's at this point the Ancient Brontodon will go to the graveyard due to state-based checks for having lethal damage assigned to it. Now there's nothing blocking our worm, so when we get to the second combat damage step, because our worm has Trample, we can simply assign 7 damage straight to our opponent, meaning our opponent will end up taking 13 damage in total during this combat damage step. How did you do? Did you get it? Let me know if you have any questions. Final quiz time. Knowing everything you now know about Deathtouch, Trample, Double Strike, and Protection, here's your final question. You attack with a green 3/4 with Deathtouch, Trample, and Double Strike. Your opponent blocks with Mirran Crusader, a 2/2 with Double Strike and Protection from black and green. How much damage can you deal to your opponent? The answer will be in the pinned comment below. Now, as always, be sure to like this video if you learned something, and don't forget to subscribe, because if you don't, I'll give all your creatures last strike and give all my creatures triple strike. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.